basically, there's 2 points I'd like to make today. So first to suggest, some people have critiqued the human in the loop as simply being a way to scapegoat human operators for the failure of systems which are beyond their capacity to control. I think these critiques simultaneously enshrine an overly conservative or restrictive conception of the function of the human in the loop in a way which elides the human in the loop's capacity for creative interpretation and intervention in the use of even complex technologies in the workplace or within automated systems. So I argue nothing because my slides aren't working. Oh. That would be the problem because it's the same as the first slide. Great, good, all right. Thank you. Okay, so I argue the inadequacy of the human in the loop, what I would describe as its anachronistic nature, is also the condition of its necessity and its possibility. Specifically, I argue that the human in the loop has not become an anachronism, but it is born as an anachronism. It's always too late, always too much after the fact. But the fact of it being after the fact compels it always to reinterpret its situation and to produce its situation anew. And this is a kind of interpretive creativity which I think can't be automated and which as such remains the necessity of the human in the loop. Second point I'd like to make is to sketch out a genealogy of the human in the loop, the human factor, the human operator, beyond the better known Anglo-American tradition, and namely within the French, the Francophone tradition of work studies. And I'd like to point to particularly 2 factors which have been influential in the French work science tradition. One is the insistence upon understanding the milieu of the workplace and its specificity, and within a broader social conception of struggle and antagonism. An antagonism which expresses itself in complex ways, but which is important to bear in mind because, as especially Veronique de Keyser argues, is only ultimately able to be taken care of by workers themselves. The second key contribution is the emphasis in French work studies on what, borrowing from the language of linguistics, is termed catachresis. Catachresis in the linguistic tradition refers to the use of an incorrect word to describe something you lack the right term for. So in French, you call a potato a pomme de terre, like an apple from the earth, even though obviously a potato is not an apple from the earth, right? So in French work studies, though, catachresis is used catachristically to describe at one level the wrong use of tools in the work environment when a given environment is found to lack the right tools for the job, but also more suggestively, the creative capacity of error, the capacity to reinterpret the meaning of work itself and of one's role beyond, or at any rate differently to the ostensibly proper definition of that role. And this kind of error I also don't think can be automated, and so remains the ironically proper, improper role of the human in the loop. Now, the figure of the human in the loop has been proposed as a safeguard against the dangers of AI and automation, but its inadequacy has been much commented upon, including by some of my learned friends in this seminar room. One of the most forceful, thoughtful, and influential critiques, though, has been that of MADELEINE ELISH and her argument regarding the human in the loop as a moral crumple zone. So ELISH traces genealogy of the human in the loop and human factors theory, arguing the human operator is often borne the brunt of blame in a way which distracts from our understanding of broader sociotechnical context of accidents and other harms. And Elish uses the term moral crumple zone to describe the way the human in the loop becomes, quote, more than just the articulation of a scapegoat. The term is meant to call attention to the ways in which automated and autonomous systems deflect responsibility in unique and structural ways, protecting the integrity of the technological system at the expense of the nearest human operator. And this is a thoughtful and welcome critique, and one which Elish supports through a careful genealogical account of the concept, and particularly through an analysis of the 3 Mile Island accident. The 1979 3 Mile Island accident marked an important inflection point in the development and regulation of automated work systems. Investigations into the partial meltdown of reactor number 2 at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant emphasized the significance of control room operator errors in the unfolding of the accident. The failure in the control room to respond adequately to cascading alarms and ambiguous indicator lights was taken by many as indicating a need to, quote, eliminate human operators from such systems as a way of eliminating human errors and enhancing system safety, as one investigator put it. ELISH argues that the way the accident was covered in the news media and in official federal investigations placed the blame for the accident unfairly on the human operator in a way which distracted from the responsibility of designers and policymakers producing inherently dangerous sociotechnical systems like nuclear power plants, and that this has colored the way that the human in the loop is framed even today. She writes, cultural perceptions of fault in automated and robotic systems may permeate formal frameworks of accountability through both media accounts and official accident reports. These perceptions influence the outcome of legal interpretations of new technology. Now, my concern, though, is that in articulating the human in the loop as a moral crumple zone, as that which crumples, we reified too much the assumptions of normative military cybernetic models of the human operator or human in the loop. ELISH's concern is with the cultural legacy, particularly of 3 Mile Island, and certainly the official government accounts thereof having contributed to this and the associated news coverage. But I would argue that the most influential and perhaps enduring American cultural account of 3 Mile Island was not the telling of the event in and of itself, but rather the hugely successful creative nonfiction of Thomas Wolfe's book, The Right Stuff, which came out several months after 3 Mile Island and became an enormous bestseller, selling several million copies and eventually being made into the eponymous film in 1983. Now, The Right Stuff isn't about 3 Mile Island, but it's essentially a history of American human factors, which is the interpretive frame that was used to define and understand 3 Mile Island. Wolfe's book is about how the daredevil recklessness of American Navy test pilot culture came to define the definition of what made for the right stuff in the human operator, as understood through the formation of that most American of 20th century heroes, the astronauts who embraced the dangerous challenge of the Gemini, Mercury, and Apollo space programs. The curious thing about this history, though, is that Wolfe's thesis is essentially that the right stuff, that which defines the normative function of the human operator, is exactly the effacement of human factors altogether. Wolfe saw the key quality of test pilots and astronauts as being essentially a finely calibrated death drive. And he positions his analysis explicitly against the effete European anti-war tradition of remark and his New World acolytes like Ford Madox Ford. Wolfe seeks to redress this anti-war tendency. And for him, the right stuff became the story of why men were willing, delighted to take on such odds in this, an era literary people had long since characterized as the age of the anti-hero. The spirit of the test pilot and the astronaut program is incarnated in the spirit of the eagerness to shut up and die like an aviator. And this is what the right stuff or courage amounts to for Wolfe. Now, Wolfe's literary historiography is, of course, exceptionally one-sided. Just as influential as Remarque, in fact, surely more influential for its political impact upon German conservatism was the work of Ernst Junger and his theorization of total mobilization, whose tragic celebration of the chthonic elemental experience of war defined the battlefield as a privileged site for the experience of the uselessness of modernity. And Junger's work, I think, provides a prefiguration of Wolfe's own, much more boy's own dollar store Kerouac account. Junger's conservative understanding of the significance of martial experience had an immense influence on Heidegger and in turn on Friedrich Kittler. And Kittler's martial determinism has in turn had an immense impact on the way much materialist media history is conducted, including, I think, the work of Peter Gallison's Ontology of the Enemy, who famously argued that to understand the specific cultural meaning of cybernetic devices is necessarily to track them back to the wartime vision of the pilot as servo mechanism. Now, we do certainly see the term human in the loop first emerge in the early years of NASA's space program, and it's obviously a borrowing from the military cybernetic concept of the man in the middle, of the cybernetic modeling of the human operator as a gunner or pilot as an element within a military servo mechanism. The problem, though, I think, in such cultural imaginaries of the cybernetic human operator and its legacies is that there's a tight coupling between the progressive critique of the human in the loop as both not culpable, as well as the conservative militarist critique of the human in the loop as not capable. In both accounts, there's a kind of helplessness the human operator faces when confronted with the immensity of modern complex socio-technical systems. And this immensity is irreconcilable with the scale of human phenomenological capacity, and so must be sublimated either in death or within the experience of the kind of blameless culpability that ELISH describes. What's remarkable, though, is to consider how the human in the loop is born as an anachronism, as military researcher and NASA engineer Joseph Saunders put it, as the weakest link in the weapon system. But what is an anachronism? For Georges Didi-Huberman, he draws attention to the creativity of anachronism. That which exists out of time demands an explanation. Why is it still here? What is it doing here? What is it which has survived of the human? And Didi-Huberman invokes the Freudian idea of afterwardsness, the compulsion to reinterpret the after-the-factedness of traumatic experience in particular, but also of experience in general. The point here is to insist upon the normative function of reinterpretation as fundamental to the production of meaning, and to argue that when this capacity is blocked or suppressed, it is not merely critical accounts which become impossible, but strictly speaking, any account at all. The human in the loop is an anachronism, but it's one which demands an explanation as well as being the one who must account for this explanation. Now, I'm running out of time, but I think it's possible to trace the genealogy of the human in the loop in a way which points to its agentive capacity, its capacity for responsibility in a socially situated and interventionist and creative way, and not merely in terms of culpability or as that which crumples. Particularly, I think there's a tradition in Francophone work studies which takes up and transforms sort of American human factors research by emphasizing, one, the workplace as a site of social antagonism, but also this idea of catachresis. Catachresis, in Yves Cleu's definition, is what happens when you lack the vocabulary to define certain ideas. So a catachristic situation is one where a tool serves a usage beyond its own, when a machine works beyond the limits of its normal function. And it's an index of the fact that users, in spite of everything, contribute to the conception of the usage of the technical artifact. In this activity, writes, there is as well an activity of reconception. So catachresis describes not simply adaptability, and not an understanding of error as the magnitude of difference between a prediction and the true value of an observation, but a kind of creative and necessary error, not simply or solely deviation from a real use, but a deviation from the norm which creates new norms and new possibilities for interpretation and reinterpretation or reconception. De Keyser, I'm concluding now. Veronique de Keyser argued that it is precisely the human operator for whom the question of risk and responsibility is most fraught, who has the most at stake, namely their lives or their mental or physical health, who must be allowed the interpretive capacity to intervene in defining their own role within the workplace, and that the evaluation of the workplace environment is a process which is, quote, continuous and collective, and conducted by workers, one in which the scientific criteria is replaced or doubled by a collective verification. So the implications of these arguments, I think, are that when we're defining the role of the human in the loop, we must understand this role in terms of maximizing what de Keyser, drawing from Simondon, refers to as the zone of autonomy, the capacity and the freedom to reinterpret and redescribe the meaning of industrial or automated systems. The human in the loop must have the freedom to reinterpret. And this capacity, I think, is as much the outcome of like workplace protections, worker organization, as of any sort of particular protocol for making the correct interpretation. So the point here is sort of to point to an alternate conceptualization of the human in the loop, in which the question of culpability cedes ground to the capacity for capability, but also for reinterpretation, intervention, and workplace solidarity, and that these should be sort of considered as key to the definition of the role of the human in the loop today as well, I think. So yeah, there we go, that's it. Question.
Yes, we have about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. So let's welcome the two speakers. And we will collect some questions.
Yeah, thank you for both of those excellent papers. I suppose this is a kind of response to the request for options, and then maybe it feeds into a question for Chris. Yeah, a lot to think through. So, I mean, when I was preparing my talk earlier, I kind of wanted to give this example, but took it out for reasons of time. But an interesting example from the stuff that I research, where the human has kind of got a particular function, but also serves as sort of as a risk vector, is in the way that the European Court of Human Rights has parsed the issue of what's called bulk interception of communications, right, for intelligence purposes, or crime fighting purposes. So basically, you know, in the aftermath of the Snowden revelations, it transpires that there's this huge apparatus for real-time interception and analysis of data, and a lot of the way in which that data is parsed is done automatically. But what the difference makes a difference, as it were, to the intelligence agents, takes the form of kind of a string of selector terms that have to be input into the interface, and then they sort of try to find things that are related to that. And European Court of Human Rights has really wrestled with what this means in terms of mass, you know, surveillance and political power and privacy and all the rest of it, and where to find a sort of balance between that. But it's really, I think, kind of slightly weird. Just in one of the most recent decision on it, the big decisions that have been made in Big Brother Watch in the Grand Chamber, the European Court found that the British oversight system, which has been kind of very heavily specified and over-determined now, has this one little lacuna, which is the point at which an intelligence operator puts in the terms for searching the system will then perform. Those selections have got to be themselves justified by reference to the values of proportionality. I mean, that's a kind of assessment that I think, like, it's pretty much automatic already, right? Because the terms are already given. So the way that these things are already audited is that they're done on a kind of, they're audited by machine learning processes. They're looking for, like, is there originality in each entry, or are they copying and pasting? So it's already a kind of a machinic kind of process. And so that's an example where the human is the kind of risk factor, but also performs a certain legal, you know, normative sort of role. And then I guess that, you know, for Chris, I mean, I guess the question simply, I mean, your presentation is brilliant, but, like, is this really work already rooted in the kind of concern for workers, which puts it antagonistically in relation to capital? And maybe doesn't make the same sense if you think about it in relation to, say, like, how the government aims to control and survey a population.
A lot to digest.
That's a great example, though. I appreciate it.
I don't know. Would be my response.
I don't know. I mean, it depends. I mean, I'm not a law scholar, you know, and I'm not an expert in, you know, European governance mechanisms. Well, sorry, maybe. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know. Well, maybe we can talk about it more later.
Thanks. So I wanted to respond to Chris's talk. Sorry, Ben, if you could sort of just so I can, as one of the folks who have been critical of the human in the loop paradigm. Yeah. So sort of just want to draw out some of more of your thinking on this, and then perhaps we should also have a longer conversation later. But I guess two points I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, one, it sort of sounded like at times you were positioning, you know, the critiques of the human in the loop as calling for just saying, get rid of the human in the loop and let the system go on otherwise without that human, which I would say is not how most of those critiques would go. So I'm sort of, you know, how do you see what the critiques are calling for as an alternative, and sort of what would you call for as the alternative, sort of given those limitations of human in the loop, that it goes beyond just saying get rid of the human overseer because they fall short. But then I sort of the other piece to maybe, you sort of have this binary between culpability and capability and sort of shifting between them. And I would say, you know, potentially that's not a binary. My particular stance on it would be that actually the problem is both, that we do have the sort of ELISH style culpability issues, but we also have capability issues that actually the types of capabilities you're calling for, even if we do design more in that direction than for pure scapegoating, are actually very hard to achieve in practice. So sort of just curious how you think about those dimensions of the human in the loop problem.
Yes. No, I should, I mean, you know, I was trying to, my point is certainly not to consider culpability and capability as binaries or as a dialectic. You know, the point is they are very close, you know, and they have to be taken up as they're a, you know, yes, part of the same problem. I completely agree. You know, this is sort of part of the thing, you know, the kind of, I guess I'm also not, I mean, I think Elish's work is brilliant, you know, and I think that account is probably the best critique I've seen of it, you know, I mean, there's very good critiques of it. The point is, you know, to kind of like coming back to this question of contingency, which seems to be kind of keep returning to, you know, today, you know, is the kind of like openness of that contingency, you know. It's not, the question is like, if you sort of consider politics as like the kind of like question of the distribution of the sensible, right? You know, it's the question of intention, you know, what is it that you kind of take as the thing you emphasize, you know? You know, within a legal framework, it makes sense to kind of focus on problems of culpability, you know, because it's a question of responsibility within a particular kind of particular sort of legal epistemology, you know. But I guess my point is the point of contingency is there's an absence or a lack at the kind of within the definition of any kind of epistemological system, and there's a kind of openness there. And if it's not the kind of human operator which is able to take that sense of culpability, then who would? You know, I can think of, I mean, it would have been better if I could have, there's examples I could draw upon here, you know, there's, in Australia, for example, we had the robo-debt scandal. I don't know if you know about this, where there was a sort of an appalling automated recalculation of social benefits, and it was disastrous, you know. It wasn't a particularly sophisticated model. It's estimated that several thousand people died from suicide, you know, as a result of the stress. So in terms of an industrial accident, it would be one of Australia's largest industrial accidents ever, right? But the point is, you know, here it's not, you have to consider it's not simply the kind of unforeseen outcome of a kind of badly designed system. You know, that operation is situated within a particular force of a political contingency. And there's sort of stories coming out. There's hopefully going to be a proper royal commission into robo-debt. But the stories already coming out. Everybody in the department knew what it was doing. It was quite plainly obvious to the humans in the loop. But they couldn't, what I'm calling reinterpretation in a broad sense. They didn't have the freedom to describe it as a bad system and to, you know, to be whistleblowers for fear of losing their jobs, essentially, right? Or for facing legal punishments, right? Now, the point, I'm not arguing that they are morally culpable in the same way that like the conservative politicians or the designers are. But my point is they were really the only ones, well, them and the actual people who were, there was obviously a social solid movement that organized against it in the end, right? Sorry.
Sorry.
No, sorry.
A quick note to the several folks who raised hands. I think we have like 5 or 6 questions. So I'll just collect all the questions all at once after we finish your answer, and then we'll send it back to you.
No, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about the intro.
No, that's all right. No, I'm going on too much anyway. But so this is the thing. It's not a particular. I recognize that it's very, you know, in terms of defining even the legal frameworks, it's very complicated in the actual whatever quotidian day-to-day operation of these things. But this is the problem. You know, contingency is dangerous. You know, and you kind of have to. I think the human in the loop is the figure who can like encounter that danger. Not in the kind of death-desiring way that Junger celebrates, but in a positive, so I think there's a possibility there for solidarity, social organization, and so forth. You know, and I think there has to be, or you know, that's the argument.
Okay, I mean, my question was sort of broadly for Chris as well, but I feel like there's probably people who have questions for JD, which maybe we need to hear about as well. So I'm happy to pass.
Hi. Yeah, this question was for JD, but it plays on this this discussion of culpability and capability we've been having. Since you mentioned capabilities, which is these LLMs, and I was just thinking when we think about the relationship between how scale might result in new forms of culpability, as well as you mentioned the let 1,000 flowers bloom approach. I would just be curious to hear more about your thoughts on that emerging, the possibility of that, expansion of access to these sorts of systems, because off the top of my head, in my networks with my AI, friends and whatnot, there was a lot of solidarity and just sort of meme formation around playing with DALL-E 2, outputs and having it do some really offensive shit that's funny and interesting, but problematic for all sorts of reasons. But there was a lot of energy on Twitter for my Twitter for 2 weeks was just taken up with all these memes from that system. So I would just be curious to hear your thoughts on those things.
We're going to collect a few questions.
This starts out as a question for JD, and then I think it also has a human in the loop implication. And I'm much struck by your concept of, let me see, labor of love. And I, have my favorite example of if I knew that the birthday card I received from my spouse was generated with a lot of help from LLM, despite the fact that it's probably better formulated and it's going to come on the right day and all of those things, I'm not going to see this as a labor of love. And it kind of gets to this thing of human in the loop, which is in that instance, the human in that loop is absolutely essential. So it kind of begs, and I don't think I've ever had this thought before with human in the loop and man in the middle, whatever it is, which is any model, any machine learning model, and it has come up in our cluster discussions, involve humans because, the training data is based on human practice, human speech, human. So machine learning people are just, we've got it, lots of humans in this loop. So anyway.
Yeah. Thanks. I had a quick question, kind of for both, but I appreciate it's not answerable in the time allowed, but it's still maybe something to think about. So time, I like the temporal element, and I think it's really important. We haven't talked about it very much at all, but of course, French philosopher Bernard Stiegler defines the production of historical time through technology and technicity. That's how we get it. And so what occurred to me here was that there's sort of really interesting thing going on with temporality. First of all, JD, do you know Grammarly? Do you know what Grammarly is? So is that what you're talking about? Because I had a visceral reaction to Grammarly as a trained linguist. I said, well, this is kind of a disaster. We're going to freeze language production in this loop of recommendations for how to finish my sentence. And this is going to ossify it's going to do something to a language process that I personally hate. And hate anyone who uses it as well. No, no, but I mean, I'm serious, right? So do you agree that there's a kind of this risk of ossifying or freezing cultural life through these products? And I mean, I guess more for Chris as well. I mean, so my critique of human in the loop in that paper, blah, 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 it would be something like, it's precisely through this frozen anachronism of what this frozen narrative or imaginary about what is happening in decision-making, that this anachronism arises. I agree with your analysis. I think it's important as a diagnostic of that sort of arrangement of the necessity and structure of that thing. But it's another version of this political problem, but I guess I come at it from quite a different angle. So I think maybe we could talk about that another time.
Great. Well, I think your first question is answerable in the time we have remaining, and that is yes.
I think Jake should get his.
I mean, put it on the table.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you know that I have this idea that, for instance, Article 22's prohibition on a fully automated decision or constraint on a fully automated decision, what's often taken to be sort of a paradigmatic human in the loop legal provision, I've argued has its roots in European industrial democracy, has its roots in workers' movements to have a say with respect to the operation of the factory system. And I was like very interested to hear the reframing of that in the context, in a different work context, where the human is the operator capable of, I'm just trying to like resolve for myself the subject position of the human in these two different accounts, and whether they are maybe the same or whether they're like, I don't know. You read that paper of mine, so maybe
that's great.
That's just.
I mean, the problem that, I mean, we've talked about this before, right? Is the question too? It's not like I'm pointing here, you know, just pointing. The project of genealogy, you know, is like it's like exploding, you know, the subject of history, right? You know, so it's just pointing to saying there's one way. American, Anglo, and even Anglo-American accounts of the human are very complex. You know, I'm wildly over, you know, making things too simple. But so just pointing to this kind of different conception and different tradition. The point is, of course, not that you can just simply take like what the French were doing in the 70s and say like, this is the normative model, you know, because exactly as we've talked about this before, the work council tradition in Europe is itself historically contingent, right? It's come out of a particular kind of historical juncture. There's, you know, and we've, which is not operative in America, not operative in Australia. There's an interesting kind of like example in the 90s that we've also talked about of kind of early forms of automation of warehouse systems, which led to like this kind of proto-Amazon thing. That led to an enormous industrial unrest and very interesting legislation, which was brought in kind of modeled, maybe not modeled, but something like the European tradition, demanding, you know, like worker contribution to the definition of KPIs and so forth. But it collapsed because like the political structure is not there for it, right? So, so I don't know. I mean, I don't think these are mutually incompatible, but the point is, you know, I'm kind of like challenging, say, like Galison, for example. He's arguing any conception of cybernetics, he talks in French theory as well, has to be traced back to this like very particular kind of military cybernetic model. And I said, you know, in my opinion, this is, you know, this is like the normative kind of methodological claim is that no, the human in the loop is itself exploded, and there's multiple traditions that we can draw upon. So it's certainly not I'm not trying to, yeah. Anyway, you get the idea.
In the interest of time, well, hand off to JD and answer, I think, 3 questions for you. But I would also just add one last question to both of you. On the theme of AI and humanity, and we're very much interested as a group, we're interested in how humanities are represented in AI, captured in AI, And I think to JD, I'm very curious what you think whether LLM brings anything categorically different in terms of how we think about humanity. And for Chris, I'm curious how AI, whether you believe AI would add anything categorically different for your work. So maybe we don't have any time for all of these, but I would love to just throw out there if you have anything to share.
Sure. I mean, I think so. The question sort of culpability and responsibility, I think perhaps those mean slightly different things. Has come up a bunch of times. And you actually, Chris, you asked the question of like, well, if not the human in the loop, then who is responsible? And I think, you know, I haven't really heard that much talk about the system designers, except in the anecdote that you gave that I wasn't familiar with about the, what did you call it? The robot death? Was it in Australia, the change?
Oh, robot death, yes,
robo-death,
yes.
What was it? Yeah, maybe a very different kind of challenge. What was the actual name? I'm sorry.
Well, I can't. The actual name was much less.
Much less exciting.
You know, if they'd called it robo-debt from the beginning, people might have been more suspicious. You know,
fair enough. But I think that
automated debt recovery algorithm. I think something like that was.
Yeah. I think that, you know, but maybe we should be asking some questions of the system designers if there's not a human in the loop, rather than you know, treating the human in the loop as sort of the end of the chain of humans involved in that.
Oh, certainly. No. Yes.
Particularly in robo-debt, in the settlement decision, there was an explicit judicial decision that none of the designers had a culpable mental state. None of them knew adequately that this was incorrect and going to cause harm in a way that would generate a legal liability.
Which is kind of a striking indictment of the capabilities of policymakers.
Oh, quite right. Exactly. No, this is the thing. I have to, you know, it's hard in 15 minutes, but I have to fundamentally reiterate that I'm not critiquing the idea that you should blame the human operator and ignore the designer and ignore policy. You know, the question is the kind of like openness of what that means by capability and culpability, and in terms of political agency. The question, I mean, it's in terms of what like AI, I mean, it does so much. Obviously, these systems are so different compared to the kind of industrial systems at 3 Mile Island. I think an interesting one, which I don't know enough about to really comment upon in any kind of intelligent way, but the functions of sort of back propagation and forward propagation in machine learning. That's sort of interesting to me as a way of maybe trying to automate this afterwardsness, you know, back and forthedness. But I think there's still there's a different kind of way of error involved here, again, in terms of magnitude, as opposed to kind of the way humans are wrong about things, which I also think has a lot to do with love, or at least with desire, or the lack of desire. You know, it's different, you know.
Fair enough, yeah. The one thing maybe I'll add in the remaining 15 seconds here is there were a number of questions. I think, Tom, you asked a question about sort of DALL-E and like, where does that sit into these kinds of questions? And I think, sorry, I can't read your name. Connell was asking a little bit about, and Helen, you were also about like, you know, who does it actually, is the human that is involved in that process have the same level of impact or effort of ownership over that part of the process? Like, is it really that person's work if in fact it was in part generated by some other system and their role was more curatorial than generative? I mean, I think these are all great questions. And Chen, you were asking also about whether or not large language models sort of bring humanity into the AI world. And I don't know that there are answers to these questions, because I think in large part, it depends on how you define these things. And in many cases, we define AI and humanity in weird exclusive ways. And it's not at all clear to me that they are exclusive, right? Like large language models do incorporate the writings of billions, if not, you know, hundreds of millions, certainly, of people, if not billions of things that they've said online, right? And that are now sort of accumulated in some relatively unknown way into a system that reproduces things that kind of look like what those people said. And so it's not clear that you can actually draw such an obvious bright line between that system and the people whose data went into it.
I'm not gonna let you go that easily with the 3 questions about, I think, the sort of unintended consequences of LLM. So we mentioned like offensive meme generation, sort of automating personal writing, and then there's a Grammarly question. Do you want to comment on that? And I think and I also want to point out, I think there's a very interesting dynamic here where Chris was critiquing the afterwardsness of the worker as well as unfortunately, you're the worker in this case. Yeah. You are trying to predict some of the second order effects before these LLMs are already ubiquitous. So like, I wonder how, I'm sure there are a lot of the part of the question cannot be answered because we don't quite know. Yeah. But like, do you want to comment on the part, like which part might be answerable?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so I think Connor, to your question about Grammarly, you know, there's this, I think there's an interesting question about the use of those kinds of systems and what they really mean, right? Like you could have made the same argument about spell checkers, like, you know, are people who use spell checkers, like, are they really? You don't think so? I mean, well, maybe we can chat about that distinction later. I think there is an open question about whether or not the, like, maybe this is what you were asking, like, are the things that are produced with the help of Grammarly then being fed back into the same training models that are then being produced sort of as though they were correct, but in fact, they're just sort of echoes of previous corrections of the existing text. Yeah, it's a different loop, totally, right? It's a loop that's now intermediated behind some other system that thinks this is correct rather than some actual human judgment, yeah. I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think I have an answer to it, Jen, sorry. I think there are explicit attempts to address those kinds of questions. Like I forget if it was GPT-3 or some other language model that explicitly said, you know, our training data ends here, and you know, please include this token in your website if you are using text that was generated by GPT-3, so that we know not to include it in future training sets. So I think this concern exists among the folks who are working in this domain, but I suspect, I mean, even if they do, you know, I suspect that most don't, right? Even if some do, just because it is, you know, to the extent that the LLM is even doing the entirety of the generation, if there's like a human curator and choosing different words, et cetera, like where do you draw the line of whether it was generated or not? Yeah.
Great. Ending on this upbeat note. Thank you, everyone. We have a short coffee break, I think, and we'll come back in 25 minutes for the next session.
15.
Oh, 15? Okay.
When?
We've still got
the boss has spoken.
Okay, good. I thought we had a very good. Yes.
Okay.
25 minutes.
30. This is like the official Simon's tea time.
Yeah, so we have 25 minutes of break, and there is some questions to pick up outside. So feel free to interrupt.